Hey, Brendan. How are you? I'm good. You too? Hey, how are you? Good. Hi, Kara. Really good. Go for it. I know. I'm not cheating. I'm exploring. I will. Okay. You're in with a different teacher. All right. Well, my clock says 9 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. You guys haven't met me yet. My name's Don Burks. Up until literally the day you started, I was head instructor here for the past 5 years. I've now moved over to lead the tech team at a company called Sphere. Um, I'll give you a very quick intro to me. I've had about a 21-year web dev career at this point. I'm entirely self-taught. I've literally never taken a programming class. But I've worked for companies like Microsoft and Best Buy at the corporate level and MetroLyrics.com. I was their senior dev for a couple years. I've done about a dozen startups. And yeah, originally I have a degree in music. So yeah, if you're complaining about what your degree started off as and where you are now, don't worry about it. Quirky fact about me, I've got I've got a few. I'll give you the one of the more famous ones. I'm really into the idea of biohacking, the idea that you can merge technology and your body. So I actually have an RFID chip implanted in my hand. That allows me, if you have NFC on your phone or RFID, you can boop your phone on my hand and immediately get my contact card. So it's kind of cool. I tried to do it so that I could just swipe in, but the swipe card holds more data than I can put on the chip in my hand. So, oh well. Um, so yeah, I'm a bit of a cyborg. Cool. So we're talking about Ajax today because you guys are in the middle of your first front end week, which means you're playing with a lot of the front end JavaScript. And Ajax was something that literally shook the web at its foundations when it started. Surprisingly, this is a technology that we have Microsoft to thank for. When it comes to web standards and innovating the way that we build the web, Microsoft is not a word that typically springs to everyone's lips. Especially Microsoft in the late 90s, early 2000s. Like, that's definitely not a time when people were thinking of Microsoft as being on the cutting edge. But Microsoft had this idea that if you had a Microsoft Exchange mail account, basically if you were using Outlook in your corporate environment for Exchange mail, that you should also be able to access your mail account from the web. And so they built something called OA, which was Outlook Web Access. And that allowed you to log in, get your mail. And what they would actually do, is in the head of the page, they would put a meta tag. And I don't even remember the syntax because it's literally been 15 years since I had to write one. But it would be something like this, and it would be a meta tag that would go in the head of the page, and it would basically tell the browser to refresh every 10 seconds. So instead of you having to go back and click a button to get your email, to refresh the page and check and see if you had new email, they're like, well, we'll just refresh the page automatically. And this was what a lot of quote-unquote webmail providers were doing at that point. Keep in mind, like 2002, there wasn't a lot of webmail. Yahoo, and I don't even think we had Gmail yet. There was only like, Angel Fire and the original Hotmail and things like that. So it was kind of an ugly world, and Microsoft said, well, we need to make this better, especially for our enterprise customers that are paying us tens of thousands of dollars in licensing fees monthly. So what they did was they started this idea of, well, hey, what we want to be able to do is load up a page and have a script on that page be able to do what a web client does, make a request to the server, standard HTTP request, and get some data back, and then do something with it, but not refresh the whole page when that data comes back. And so they came up with this idea of AJAX. And AJAX is the acronym that stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Which is kind of funny when you break it down. So it's XML because Microsoft originally designed it, and Microsoft loves XML in a passionate way. But saying asynchronous JavaScript is kind of like saying chai tea or the Sahara Desert. Chai tea just means TT, and Sahara Desert literally means desert. So asynchronous JavaScript is redundant. JavaScript's asynchronous by default. So that kind of doesn't make sense. And then XML outside of Microsoft very quickly went away and got replaced by JSON. But AJAX doesn't sound quite as sexy when it rolls off the tongue. To say that this lit a fire in the web development world is an understatement. It's probably too soon to say that this went off like Notre Dame. But that's not the worst comparison. The thing is, you've probably heard in history of the term Web 2.0. And Web 2.0 was kicked off by AJAX. And at the end of the day, Web 2.0 was AJAX, rounded corners, and gradients. That was what defined the standards of Web 2.0. But the really cool thing was that AJAX now opened up the door for proper web applications. Because now, when you think about loading up an application, like let's say I'm going to load up Microsoft Word, I log in, I open up Word, I'm sitting there in a document, and I can type into that document, I can save it to my file system, I can do all of the tools and things that I would want to do with that document, do the word count, do the formatting, and all of that. And Word never has to close down and reopen to handle the changes that I've made to that document. That would be ridiculous. So that's the benefit of applications, is that we get this persistent kind of experience, and it's way better for the user. So AJAX now enabled web pages to give the user that kind of experience. You're able to open up an application in the web, in your browser, and you're able to just sit there and look at that screen and have all the data transfer going on happening in the background, and you are completely, like, it's transparent to you. You don't see it happening. And in fact, from the user's perspective, there's actually a really cool thing going on, which is you don't have to care. As a web user in any other type of situation, a standard kind of HTTP app, you would go in, you would type something into a form, you would hit submit, and you would do that knowing that at the moment you hit submit, that page is going to effectively close down, send all the information to the server, wait for a response back, new page is going to come up. You would actually kind of work around having to wait those couple of seconds for your information to go to space and back so that you could get the next page that you were going to work with. That was actually part of your workflow. Well, now you didn't have to worry about that. You could just type things in, hit submit, keep going, move to another tab, and it provided such a better user experience in terms of using the web. So it became very popular for people to start building out these web applications. Now, Ajax kind of became like Frank's Red Hot. It got put on everything. Whether it needed it or not, every site became an Ajax site. Kind of like now, every site gets WebSockets and React. Whether it needs it or not, the developer just thinks, well, those are cool technologies, therefore I'm going to build something with those. But this is where, in the early 2000s, we really started to build this idea that the web was not just a place for viewing blogs and cat gifs and porn anymore. There was actually like a valid reason to be inside this browser, and that businesses could not only run using tools in that browser, but now businesses could run that were the tools in the browser. You could now build a business around providing an application that ran in the browser. And this is where we got the wonderful world of what we call SaaS. And I'm not talking about Instagram SaaS, I'm talking about software as a service, where software could now be run through your browser and allow you to do things. And we started to see the first infant versions of stuff like Google Docs. And we started to see a whole different world when it came to chat rooms, for example, because chat rooms were literally doing the meta refresh thing up until Ajax. And now that they could synchronize information in the background, oh my gosh, this was amazing. So what made it all possible was an object that got added to JavaScript. So this was an update to the language itself. And this object still exists for us, and it is the XML HTTP request object. And what the XML HTTP request object does, and in fact we can hop into MDN, and we can see if I make it big enough, we can see it. Literally, it's a function. That's it. It's an object, because functions are object, but it's just a function, and you run it, and it has a couple of properties on it that you get to play with. And the one that's the most important is this one, on ready state change, which is a terribly named property. But it's a property that you can attach a callback function to. So one of the things you've probably learned this week in terms of working with front-end JavaScript is that JavaScript is incredibly event-driven. JavaScript was built around the idea that the user was going to interact with the page. They were going to type something in a box, they were going to click a button, they were going to scroll, they were going to click and hold down the mouse and maybe drag things around. Like, those are events that happen in the browser. And then we attach functions that listen for those events happening, and when that event happens, we do a thing. Those are callbacks. So onReadyStateChange gave us the ability to say, when the state of our request changes, run this function. So in other words, if I call you on the phone and I'm sitting there and it's dialing and it's ringing because you're looking at that little box in your pocket going, wow, I've never used that app before. Then I'm sitting there waiting, and then eventually you'll figure out the green button, you'll answer the phone, and the state of that has changed. And you're going to be like, hello? And then we get to have a conversation at that point. So when the state of my request changes, I have a function that I can run that's in response to that. Encoding directly with XML HTTP request isn't the most fun, because there's boilerplate, just kind of standard code you have to put in there every single time. You're looking for the HTTP status code to make sure it's a 200 or a 300 series. You're having to deal with what happens if it's not 200 or 300, 301, 302, something like that. And you're basically having to deal with all these different properties. That sounds like a bit of a pain. So in response to that, jQuery came along, and when it came along, Oh, where's my overall Ajax? There it is. When Ajax came along, one of the things that jQuery very quickly jumped on the bandwagon with, because jQuery just started off as DOM manipulation, it very quickly wrote a wrapper around XML HTTP request. Because the idea of jQuery was write it once and use it in every browser. To start with, XML HTTP request was only available in Internet Explorer. It very quickly jumped to Firefox and Netscape and a bunch of other browsers. But jQuery wanted a version of Ajax that was available to be used anywhere. And so the original version of Ajax in jQuery wasn't great, but about 2008, roughly, there was a guy named Julian Oborg, who was a web developer, lived in Texas, and he decided that he was going to rebuild everything. And he spent about 3.5 months learning everything there was to know about Ajax. And all of a sudden, one day, like he wasn't even part of the jQuery team, one day he was just like, hey, I'm submitting this big pull request to the jQuery repository because it's open source, anybody can contribute. He just dumps in this huge pull request that completely rewrites Ajax, makes it almost literally 100 times faster than it was before, improves the whole process, and kind of standardized how Ajax was going to be done on the web after that point. So now that there is a standard, and now that we are 11 years past that, and Ajax is a very mature, very robust technology at this point, we get to learn how to do some cool stuff with it. So the basic premise behind Ajax is this main function here, jQuery.ajax, which when we are writing it, just turns into $.ajax. jQuery.ajax, same thing. And there's two ways that you can call it. You can call it and pass a URL as the first parameter, and then an optional settings object as the second one. But it's way easier just to call jQuery.ajax and pass it a settings object. And the settings object has a number of different keys that you are able to put in there, but you don't have to put all of them, which is great, because if you had to do that for every Ajax request, we'd still be writing code that we started in 2008. So there's a few that are really standard, and I will point those out to you now. The first one, URL. URL is important. URL is either going to be a relative URL, like, say, /posts. So that means it is requesting from the same server that the page was loaded from. Or it's going to be a full URL, like mysupercoolapp.com/posts. So it could be that. And that is only going to work if that domain is going to allow anyone to do Ajax requests from it. Ajax requests are just HTTP requests, but they have a different media type. Normally, when we're making a request in the browser, we're requesting text/HTML. That's the content type that we're requesting. Or we are requesting text CSS or application/JS. Because we're requesting a JavaScript file, but we're not requesting JSON data. We're requesting what are typically called static assets. Whereas JSON data is something that is data coming directly out of the database, and that ends up having different rules around it. So if you're requesting from another domain, that domain has to allow you to make that request. Most of the time, though, you're just going to be requesting from your own domain using a relative URL. So the other thing that we want is method. Get, usually. We can send data with a post. Ajax also doesn't suffer the same restriction that HTML forms do. HTML forms can only do get or post, But with Ajax, we can do put, patch, delete, info, any of the 19 HTTP verbs that are out there. We can do all of them by defining the method here. Again, most of the time, get or post. And then, most importantly, we get to define a success function and a failure function. And this is what happens when the request succeeds, or, you guessed it, fails. And so these are our callback methods. And so at the end of the day, this whole thing here is just a JavaScript object. It's keys and values. And so the cool thing that jQuery does for us is with the success object, it's going to automatically take whatever data comes back from the server and give it to that success function in whatever format it comes in. And with the failure, it's automatically going to give us an error object as the first parameter. So those are things that we are guaranteed that jQuery is going to do for us, which is really helpful. Now, there are other things that we can do. We can set a data type on our Ajax settings, and the data type is going to tell us, or more importantly, tell the code, what data type we expect the response to come back in. So if we tell it that it's JSON, then this will automatically be run through json.parse for us. That's helpful. Because if we don't specify that, generally the first thing we're going to have to do, well, I guess we can use const. The first thing we're typically going to have to do is that. But if we have the data type JSON, we don't have to do that. It's already an object. That's helpful. But we could specify HTML, we could specify CSV, we could specify PDF. Honestly, it's whatever type we expect to get back. And then is what would be passed to the success function. But in this case, most of the time, like I said, we're going to be getting JSON data back. And when we run this, this is an asynchronous function, which means we will run this code, but we can't predict exactly when the success function is going to run. It's at some point in the future. So whatever code we put right after, guaranteed that code is going to run before the success function does. This does not stop and wait for success to happen before it moves on. We've just said, hey, when you do get a response at some point in the future, then run this function. Clear as mud so far? Cool. So, developers being the way we are, we realize that this often gets into a lot of typing. And so what happened was there were some shortcut methods developed in jQuery that make this a bit easier. So we have $.yet, and it takes this syntax. And basically what this is saying is that we're going to get data from a URL, and we are registering a success callback function. We are assuming that it's not going to fail. We're not specifying a data type. We're just saying, hey, I want to go get some data, and then here's the callback function that's going to deal with it. But because we deal with JSON a lot, we also have this. And by the way, yes, you can totally use fat arrow functions here. I just have muscle memory of typing out function with jQuery. In this case, the difference between line 26 and line 30 is that line 30 is assuming that the data that comes back is going to be JSON, and therefore jQuery will automatically run json.parse on it before it goes to the function. Helpful. If you do this version, and you're getting JSON back from this, data is going to be a string. If you're using this version, and you're getting JSON back from this, data is going to be an object. So that's important for you as a dev to know the difference between those two. And also we have $.post. Which is very similar, except it typically takes 3 parameters. The first one is the URL. The second one is whatever data you are posting to the server. And there's a number of ways that you can put that data in. The standard is to do an object, and then a success function. So these are shortcuts. These are wrappers around AJAX, which are a wrapper around XML HTTP request. And these are just there to keep you from having to write out that big AJAX object every single time that you're going to send data through. So this is the basics of working with AJAX in jQuery, but that's all theoretical. How about we look at some actual code? Sound good? Cool. You guys will learn to be interactive with me. It takes time. So what I have done is I have set up a very basic Express server. It's super basic, like we didn't need cookie parser, we didn't need body parser, we didn't need a whole bunch of stuff. So I stripped all of that out, and there's one route that is going to get slash, and it's going to render the index view. That's all it does. And that index view is an EJS file that looks like this, that has no EJS in it whatsoever. And what I've done is I have included jQuery in the head, and then I've also included another JavaScript file, and that's where we're actually going to write some code. And we're going to play with AJAX. And when I run this, it starts up, and it looks like this. Exciting. Anybody blown away by my minimalist design? I spent like a pair of seconds styling this. So, yeah. So right now, not very exciting. What makes it exciting is this right here. So JSON placeholder is, as it says, a fake online REST API for testing and prototyping. So this is a service that somebody put up that is just there as a helper for developers. And it serves up fake JSON data. And in particular, it follows the standards that we would see in the universal blog example that you would have. And so it gives us posts, comments, albums, photos, to-dos, and users. Things that you would probably find on a blog. And so, for example, if I look at the posts, and I have an extension in Chrome that formats JSON for me, because otherwise it comes back and looks like that, and my eyes tend to bleed. And that's even pretty good, the way they've got it formatted. But this is just like lorem ipsum data that is showing up here. And it's got random user IDs. Each post gets its own title, its own ID, its own body. Theoretically, what's happening is this is being pulled out of a database. If this was a real world example, this would be the list of posts on mygreatblog.com, and it'd be pulled out of the database and served up to the front end. And then we would need to do something with that raw data on the front end to make it be formatted data. Almost as if you were building a clone of Twitter and there was a whole bunch of tweets that you had to pull in to your application and then format somehow. Crazy idea, I know. Work with me. So this is a free service that's out there. It allows us to pull this data in. Holy crap, Nima got a haircut. Nima, that's just what... You can't get haircuts like that. It throws me off my game. So we have this service that's out there that we can pull raw data in from, which is great. I mean, there's a bunch of free APIs that are out there. There's like the Pokemon card game. There's the one that's literally the NFL arrest history. So it's all the times that NFL players have been arrested for crimes. kind of terrifying. There's ones for Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. There's the dog API. There's a bunch of stuff that's out there that we can pull from. This one is just nice because it's just fake data, and you don't get trapped into looking at pictures of dogs all day. So it's out there. We can make a request to it. So what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to set up something so that we can load up our page, and then we will click a button. When we click that button, it will go make an AJAX request and fetch data from this API, and then we will put it onto the page. Sound good? Sounds great. I knew it. I knew you'd agree with me. Mainly because you're like, this guy's crazy. I'm going to shut up. Let's start off with the basic part of what is in our JavaScript file. So I started off with just this. And I will also start off with one of my pet peeves, which is, if you are still typing this, please stop. There's no point. It's redundant. Does not make you any cooler. Nobody's going to like you extra because you did it. I don't care if it's on Stack Overflow. That's document ready. In fact, if you go into the jQuery source code and you look at the part of the code where it is processing what gets passed to the jQuery function, there is a comment at the point where it says, hey, if this is a function, it literally says this is a shortcut to document ready. So I'm now going to save you all the typing of having to type out document parentheses .ready forever. There's no point. And in fact, now that modern browsers support fat arrow functions, we can do that, and that's document ready. So that's a heck of a lot easier to type. So this says when the document has been fully parsed by the browser, here's the callback function that is going to run. So we said that what we want to have is we want to have a button that when we click on it, it will do a thing. So I've got a button now, and it's still running, and all I did was add a button. So there we go, button. And now what we want is we want to be able to get that button. So I gave it an ID so I could select that button exactly. So when we click on this button, something should happen. To make sure it works, well, actually, let's be really crazy with it. I want to make sure it works, so I'm going to do a refresh so that I get the code loaded back in. Click me, boo. Cool. jQuery works. That's a good thing to know. Because if that doesn't work, there's no point in me writing any code for AJAX. If that part right there doesn't work, it doesn't matter how clever I am, doesn't matter how much I follow the documentation, does not matter how much I Google, does not matter how much code I've copied and pasted from Stack Overflow. If that doesn't work, doesn't matter. So now I know that that works, I can move onwards. So when I click the button, I want to do the AJAX request. So we're going to start off and we're going to do it long form. And we need the URL. So that is this base URL here. And it's going to be /posts because that's the one that I want. So I have a URL. My method is going to be get. I know I'm going to get JSON back. I just proved that because I loaded that API route in my browser. By the way, never, ever, ever in your history as a developer, ever start writing code for AJAX where you haven't loaded that code in the browser first. Because just because it's an API doesn't mean you can't load it in the browser. It's just an HTTP request. So you can put that same URL in the browser, and if you can't get data back there, it's not going to work in your code. Save yourself the grief. It takes about 17 seconds of your time, and that's if you're on dial-up, and you will be much happier knowing that you've got that data, because if you don't have the data, you literally don't have an application. So always start with the data first. So my data is going to come back as JSON. And I want to have a success function. And we will go ahead and we will put a failure function in. And for the failure function, we're going to say console.log error. So at this point, we want to work iteratively, and I just want to see the data that I get back. I want to make sure that the data that I just loaded in my browser tab matches the data that I'm going to get back when I make this request. So, go back over here to my app, open up my console, make my console big enough that you can actually see it, and refresh. Yeah, whatever. I don't have a favicon. In Chrome, always requests a favicon from every site. So, click me. Ta-da! Data. That's a lot of data. Because it tells us that it sends through, by default, 100 posts. The placeholder tells me that. So, that's what I expected. That's good. And if I open this up, then there's a whole bunch of things. And if I take a look at one of them, I have a title, a user ID, a body, etc., etc. So that's what I would expect to get back. And so now what I can look at doing is thinking, okay, so now I have this array of 100 things, and how do I get this data in and work with it in a way that makes sense? So I'm going to let you think about that for 10 minutes while you take a break, and then when you come back, we'll do that. I like it. It just shocked me. It was a surprise. Yeah, but I'm used to you going, down or coming in, or yeah, somewhere in between. Good. Yeah, I actually got to code all day yesterday. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. me the MP. What's his name? Yeah. Yes, you bet me. I'm sorry. Although I called H. Left it in the yep. And probably on the top. I still, oh yeah. I gave that to me. It wasn't there. Huh? Wasn't. Oh. Oh. I'm on it. Yep. Yes. Yes. Where are we doing it? Classroom. I could sit on one of those and come. Awesome. We knew some. Yeah. Actually, Remy's conference might. Okay. Because the person who has the snowball mic probably would forget to bring it. I mean, he'd say today that with all the best of intentions, and he'd probably forget. No, I would turn it off. Get like a little, oh man. There's a last one right. Okay, let's dive back in. So, quick recap. Before break, we got ourselves to the point where we could load a page, we could click a button, and it would go off and fetch data and come back with that data, and we didn't have to reload the page to get any of that to happen once the button got clicked. So, now what we want to do is we want to take some or all of these posts, and we want to show them on the page. So, now that we know that we can get the data, let's look at what we would do to actually render it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give myself a section tag so that I have a place to put the results. I don't just want to append it to body. Typically, when I'm loading data into the page, it's going to have a specific place on the page it's going to go. So that's why I'm going to put a section tag here. Plus, semantically, section tag in HTML5 means all of the content in this tag is related to each other somehow. So double benefit there. So instead of just console.logging out the data, what I'm going to do is, we know the data is an array. We saw that literally here, array of 100. Since it's an array, that means I can do what with it? I like your answer better, mainly because I didn't hear what you said. But yes, that was the one I was looking for each. Pretend I have a stack of virtual cookies on the corner of my desk and you just got one. I'll give you one too, even though I have no idea what you said, but you responded, so you get a cookie. It means I can for each through them. So if I can for each through them, then that means I can define a set of work that I'm going to do literally for each one of those things in the array. So we will write our for each, and it's going to get one parameter, which is the post itself. And so this is just the ID, the title, the body, the user ID for that particular post. So what we will do now is we are going to create an article tag. And we are going to, we'll do that. We're also going to want like a header in that article because that's where we would put the title. And I'm going to use the text method from jQuery. I'm not going to use the .html method for two reasons. One is I'm not actually passing HTML to it. And two, the text method is always faster than the HTML method because the HTML method takes whatever you pass to it and runs it through the HTML engine. So if there's no actual tags in there, I'm just burning up cycles for no apparent reason. So I'm going to use text, and I'm going to assign it, or post.title. And then, because it's jQuery and I can chain things, I'm going to append my header to the article. And then I'm going to create a paragraph tag. Actually, yeah, I'm going to create a paragraph tag. And if I want to be really semantic about it, I'll create a main tag. And I'm going to set its text to be post.body and append that to my article. So now I have an overall article representing one article of content, and it's got a header and it's got a main. And if I really want to be complete about it, I'll give myself a footer as well. and I will append that to the section. So I'm going to build each one of my posts. And then I'm going to take that post, once it's fully built, and append it to my section tag. And that's what I'm going to do for each one of the posts in my array. So, with that in mind, we're going to refresh. We don't need this open anymore. We're going to cross our fingers, eyes, and toes. And that worked. Looks like crap, but it worked. You know, we can very quickly style this. Like I said, literally a pair of seconds. Article tags, we're going to give them 1 pixel border. Since we're doing things in the Web 2.0 style, we'll round the corners. We're going to give some spacing on the inside of it, and we're also going to give some margin around it. And when we have an article header, font size 1.2 EM, font weight bolder, and you know what, why not? Color tomato. So, with that in mind, now that looks a lot better. It's not great yet, but it's better. And now we can see each individual post. And there's 100 of them. There's a lot of them. So, at a basic level now, we can say that we have solved the problem that we set out to solve. We have a web page that we can load in our browser. We have a button that when we click on it will fetch data from a remote source. And then once we have that data, we're then going to process it and put posts on our page. But we're not done by any stretch. And this is, I mean, you've probably already learned this with TinyApp. You probably learned a lot of things like how to curse with TinyApp. But there's solving the problem, and then there's being done with what you're building. Because this isn't at a point where I would want to deploy it, where I would want to sign my name on it and say, yes, this is the best version of this solution that I can make. I mean, if somebody's trying to get into the nice, sweet red bits inside of a watermelon, a hammer works, and it solves the problem. May not be the best solution. You know, an 18-wheeler smashing the watermelon against a wall solves the problem. May not be the best solution. So we want to now look at what we have built and decide if we have made the best solution or not. For example, what happens now if I click on Click Me again? Would we? Well, we're going to rerun the code, yes. But what's that going to do to my UI? Yes, you get another cookie. I'm going to get 100 new posts. So I will then have 200, and then click it again, and 300, and click it again, and 400. Not really what I wanted. If I'm, you know, let's say this is the front page of Reddit or CNN or something like that, and I'm refreshing to see if there are more stories, it should take whatever's on there right now and get rid of it, and then show me more stories. So let's make that happen. Fortunately, jQuery makes that easy for us. In my success, if I am in my success method, then that means, hooray, I got data back. So I can just do that. And I will empty out that section tag. So I click, There's 100. The last one is this one. And when I click again, it's the same number. I know it's kind of hard to tell. But there, yeah, it is actually just the same number of things. Because otherwise, it would have just kept appending and appending and appending without that. And I mean, we can make that happen pretty easy. And then, because I'm a standard Muggle web user, I'm going to click like 6 times because that makes it go faster, right? So there, I've clicked it a whole bunch. And if you're looking at my scroll bar, you might start crying right about now. Still going. Not even halfway down the page yet. So definitely not the experience we want. So that's why this is a great idea when you are dealing with Ajax content. Reset your state, of how things are showing, and then process this. Cool. So that gets us one more step closer down the road. But now I'm going to look at the code itself. And the code itself is something that I want to start refactoring right away. Because I've got very clearly callback hell going on here. And you can see the callback hell visually. When my code starts to look like a big arrow, like a big greater than sign, that is my signal that I need to start refactoring things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of this code, let's call it make post. Wow. So now I have this function, which is just out there sitting, doing its own thing. And scope-wise is totally fine, because this is the function that I'm now going to run here in my for each. So I'm passing a reference to a function to my for each, make post. jQuery is still going to pass one parameter to it, and it will still run. Let's actually watch that happen. Ta-da, still works. Well, that's cool. But it also means that I can take this piece and I can do that. And for my success function here, I can call get posts. And when I do that, still works. But now I'm starting to break things out and make them easier to read and easier to maintain. If I really wanted to get fancy, yep, too far. There we go. And now, instead of seeing this big nested set of code that I now have to chase down where all the matching closing curly braces are and hope that I've indented everything correctly, now it's a lot easier to read. Which is cool, because that makes it easier to maintain. And as long as it still works, that's what matters. So now with all of that in mind, I can go a step further, which is I can take this code and I can shorten it to that. And that one line does almost everything that lines 17 to 25 are doing. I'm doing a GET request. I'm specifying my data type as JSON. And when I get data back, that data is going to get pushed to GET posts. And I would much rather maintain one line of code than 7. I don't know about you guys. So, and again, as long as it works, that's the important part. Working code is worth more than pretty code. But if I can have working pretty code, win-win. Makes everybody happy. Now, the other thing is I could take all of these functions and I can put them inside my document ready and it'll work perfectly fine. And then all of those functions are scoped inside of that callback function. Some people would argue that is the better way to do it. And they'd be right. They'd also be wrong because it's my opinion. Software development is opinionated, and so I chose to put them there because that keeps this nice and clean. It also means that if I really, really wanted to, I could do this. So now all of those are inside of one variable, one object. And so now I've only made one variable. Instead of making a bunch of variables that are technically in my global space at that point, I've now made one variable. So I have one object that I can keep adding keys to and keep adding callback handlers to, whether it's for eaches, whether it's for button clicks, whether it's for form submissions, whatever it happens to be, they can all go in this one place. And then I'm in great shape. If I really wanted to get fancy with it, I could take all of these handlers and put them in their own JavaScript file. And as long as that file got loaded before this file, they would all be in scope. So that means I now have one file that is all of my handlers. I've modularized it. And then I have my actual code itself, which would be 3 lines of code. That would be what would be running this app. I use app in the most loosely generous sense at this point. Questions about how we got to this point? You are all Ajax wizards, ninjas. Yes. Yes. Unfortunately, it doesn't. So that's the one thing that I end up compromising by using getJSON, is I don't have a custom failure condition. jQuery has one built in. So jQuery by default will just console.log the error. It's no different than what I've done with it. So the failure will still happen, and I will see the failure show up in the console. But what I could do if I really wanted to be fancy is I could do something like I could do something like that as a failure condition, and then whatever error message, like we were unable to retrieve your content, or you're not allowed to use this anymore, or whatever it is, that error message would come up in the section instead of just dying silently. The default is to just die silently. So if I did want, and that it's actually really good you asked that question, because it's one of the things I was going to summarize at the end, is if you do want to have a custom failure behavior, the shortcut methods of get JSON, and .post don't work the best for you. If we look at get JSON, yeah, unfortunately, it only takes the 3 parameters, so we literally don't even have a way to like pass additional parameters and get that. So unfortunately, yeah, if you want to have that failure callback defined with a custom behavior, you have to use $.ajax. Some would argue that using $.ajax is the proper thing to do because it gives you that full robustness, but there's also the side to it where, let's say these posts were coming from our application, like this was our blog. We could justifiably run .getJSON at that point, because if our app isn't running and we can't request posts from it, this page wouldn't have loaded in the first place because it's all within Express. So in that case, if this page would have never loaded, there's no point in defining a failure condition, because the likelihood that it's going to die before that response comes back, extremely unlikely. So getting philosophical and saying that every line of code you write is a bit of a compromise, this is one of those times where if you have the relative assurance that the app is always going to be up and running, and that you know, if this page loaded, therefore you can request data, then get JSON is fine. But especially if you are requesting data from a third-party API, $.ajax is probably the better way to go in that case, so that you can explicitly define the success and the failure functions. Cool. So so next thing I would want to do, given this, is I would probably want to look at things like maybe not showing 100 posts at once. That probably is not something that I would want to do. So if we know that data is my array of posts, then what I can do is I can slice out 10 of them and just show 10 posts at a time. Ten posts, a lot easier to look at. The other thing is, does that really help us? Written by one. Do we know who one is? No. It's not a hacker forum, so people probably aren't going to be going by a single number as their username. So what we need to be able to do now is we need to be able to query the API for the user information for each post. Fortunately, there is a users. And more than that is I can also take users and, in a very RESTful way, add the ID to the end of the URL, so user/1, and RESTfully speaking, that means I want, from the user's resource, I want the resource whose ID is 1, and I get back a name for that user. In fact, I not only get back a name, I get back a username and an email address and street address, and this is all just fake data that's generated. This isn't actually a person who lives in Gwenborough. And their website and everything else. So that means I can now query this data, and I can do that before I display the post. which is kind of neat. So let's do that. So to solve the basic problem, what I would do is oh, poop. Post.user ID. I could also use a template string there, which actually probably would be better. There we go, template string. So now what you see that I've done is I've wrapped that around making the footer. And now that I have that user data, it's get.json. So now I can, let's change this one to a template string as well. User data dot name. And then let's actually add to that. And we will do user data dot email. Put that in parentheses after their name. And there's something interesting that's going to happen, and hopefully the internet's going to be slow enough on this rainy day that we will get to see it happen. So did you see how it kind of cascaded down? I'll do it one more time. Pay attention to what's actually going to happen visually. So all the articles show up, and then they all shift because the user information fills in. So it almost looks like an accordion effect, which is happening because we're making another asynchronous request. So the post gets created. In the middle of the post getting created, we go out to the internet to fetch more data. The post gets added to the page, and then that data comes back and adds the footer into it. And so we get this staggered kind of rendering thing happening. And if that wasn't what you wanted, you realize that we have created what we call a race condition, where we are in a race to get all of the data into the article before the article gets put on the page. Easy fix. Put the article.append inside the callback for the user. So we don't add the article to the page until we have all the data in the article. And then, just like we wanted it to be, all those articles come in as whole things instead of staggering the way they were before. So now the challenge is we have this other get.json here, and we have this callback function embedded inside of makePost. And if we wanted to abstract this out and have, for example, another function to get the user data, this doesn't work for us the way we want it to. And does anybody see why? This will fail, by the way. And I will show you how it will fail. Handlers.getUserData. And we'll say user data just as we did before. Last chance to guess why it's going to fail. Yeah. Not a bit. Yeah, order of methods do not matter in this case. That's a good question. The thing is, because the interesting thing about the way JavaScript does object definition is because the object is defined all at once, therefore the order of the keys in the object doesn't matter. Also, with objects specifically, JavaScript does a rather cool thing where if we were to log this object out, say 10,000 times, there's no guarantee that all 10,000 of those times the keys would appear in the same order. Maybe 9,999 of them are going to be in the exact same order as I define them, but there might be one time where it's slightly different. And it's just because of the way JavaScript defines the object in memory. So what's cool is as long as the object itself exists in in memory with all these keys defined, they all have scope for each other. Good question, though. Cookie. Yep. I did on line 6. Handlers.getUserData. Right here. Five, four, three, two, one. No takers. Okay. Let's watch it fail. Womp womp. Ten errors that are exactly the same. And what does it say? Article is not defined. On line 9. So if we go to line 9 and we look for article, well, we see it right here. We're trying to append our footer to article. And that worked perfectly fine when article was up here. Scope. Scope is everything. So the problem is, if we break this out into its own function this way, we lose that scope of the last article. You know, the one that was created specifically for this. And in fact, we can't query it inside this function because that article doesn't exist in the DOM yet because it hasn't been added to the section. It's sitting in memory just as a variable. So there are two ways around this. One of which is to not call this out as a separate function and go back to the way we were doing it before. Or what we can do is we can do what we were doing before, but we're going to do that. Here, article is still in scope. And so we keep the callback function there in line 6 to catch the data that comes back from the AJAX request. And then we take that data and we pass it along to our handler along with the article that we need. And now article is defined because it's being passed as a param. And therefore here, when we append to article, and we take article and append it to the section, now we have scope for that variable again. And now it works again. That's the better solution. Not just going back to where it worked before and going, okay, it works now, I'm not touching it anymore. Trust me, I understand the urge. But again, this is that constant push and pull that you're going to have as a dev from now until the heat death of the universe to decide when is it good enough. You know, when is the point when you are willing to sign your name on it and call it done? And we're always going to be pushing and pulling between working code and the perfect version of every single possible algorithm that we could write. We're always going to be fighting that battle. And I will tell you right now, you will always lose. 100% of the time, you will always lose. And the reason you will always lose is we aren't perfect. And if you get wrapped up in trying to find that perfect version of the code, you are chasing the wrong problem. The code has to work, and then the code that makes it into the build of the product that you are supporting needs to be maintainable by the next dev that has to touch it. Those are your two jobs. You didn't get to hear me rant about it in week 1, but one of the things I tell every cohort that I've taught is nobody hires you to code. And you're like, great, what did I just spend $10,000 on? But nobody's ever going to hire you to code. That's not what HR people, that's not what dev companies, that's not what other companies that have dev products. In every single case, you are getting hired to build and support a product. That's what you are going to be doing. It doesn't matter if you're hired by QuickBooks or Doom, like id Software, or Slack or Spotify or Shopify or whoever it is. You're not getting hired to write lines of code. Code is how you are going to add features and fix bugs and expand out their product so that they can make more revenue. But that's their job. That's the company's job, is to have a product that makes revenue. If they don't make revenue, you don't get paid. So in a case like that, you have to think about, okay, I've solved that problem of being able to fetch this data from somewhere on the web and get it displayed on the page. Then what's the right version of that solution that I'm willing to come back and work on, that I'm willing to pass to the next person in the dev team and have them work on and not hate me? You have to have a working solution, and it has to be maintainable. So that's the push and pull you're always going to have when you're writing code. And just because we are not as perfect as computers are, we will always lose that battle. There's almost always another way to write it, and people will argue that that's a better way because, if I give you directions from here to Stanley Park, I may take you down Pender, other people may take you down Georgia. We're both right. We're both going to get you there, and we might even argue between ourselves as to which way is the better way, depending on traffic and traffic lights and whether you want to stop for bubble tea on the way, and like all of those things might be factors, but we're both right. And that's why, for example, it's actually cool for us as mentors and instructors when we're seeing, 15 versions of TinyApp come in and 15 versions of Tweeter come in, because we're seeing how each one of you chose to solve that problem. And everyone is just slightly different. There's similarities, but they're different. In fact, people tend to code with an accent. Those that are here every single day, by the end of the cohort, they will be able to look at a piece of code and know which one of you wrote it. The same way that we have manners of speech and body language and things like that, your code ends up picking up an accent. So when you're making decisions like how to solve this problem on line 7, you have to ask yourself, 6 months from now, when I have to come back and add a feature to this or change this behavior, what code do I want to have to work with? What is the code that I'm not going to do a get blame on and, who wrote this crap? Oh man, it was me. I mean, there's no worse coder than you 3 months ago anyway. Like, everybody will go back and look at their code. If you want something fun, go back and look at your prep work. Like your Loopy Lighthouse. Go back and look at your solution for that and think about how differently you would write that now. And you'll be like, oh my God, and I thought that was hard. And I always love telling grads, like the week before they're going to graduate or the week before demo day, to go back and look at TinyApp. Because you just got done climbing that mountain. 6 weeks from now, you're going to look back at that and be like, I could write that in 4 hours. But yeah, the thing is, when we get to points like this, you actually want to have to challenge yourself, and you want to have to ask that question, am I willing to put my name on this? Is this good enough? Is it done? Does this actually solve the problem and leave the next person able to make changes from here? So those are some of the considerations that you would have when approaching something like this. and I think I've riffed almost enough to get us to 10:30. Yeah, because at this point, I just start adding other resources that we would have to fetch, and it gets repetitive at that point. So anybody have any questions about how we got to here? Crickets, tumbleweeds. Awesome. I'll send this code out as a repo. I'll also send you links to the Ajax documentation on jQuery's site and the JSON placeholder that I used. Cool. Thanks, folks.